Welcome to our latest episode of Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast. This is David Helvarg, and my co-host is Vicki Nichols-Goldstein.
Welcome from Boulder, Colorado.
Today, we're honored to be talking with Jared Huffman, Democratic Congressman representing California's 2nd Congressional District that stretches along what I call the Redwood Coast from the Golden Gate to the Oregon border, some 350 miles north. An All-American volleyball player in college, he went on to work as an attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council in the California State House for 6 years, and then was elected to Congress in 2012. Among his many recognitions, he's a climate and ocean champion, recently led and is now the ranking member of the House Resources Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries. And among the bills he sponsored or helped pass are ones to ban shark fin sales, protect salmon, and help the communities respond to the collapse of Northern California's kelp forest that are essential to Northern California's economy and ecology. But before we get into all of that, you were raised in the Midwest. When did you first connect with the ocean?
Well, thank you, David and Vicki, for having me. Oddly, I was this landlocked Midwesterner growing up, but I was fascinated with whales and dolphins. I remember one summer as a very young kid going to an amusement park. And, today I look at marine mammal captivity very differently. But at the time, I was mesmerized by the dolphins, and one of the trainers allowed me to stay after the show and pet the dolphin, and I was hooked. I learned everything I could about the genus and species of every whale I could. I was reading books about the ocean, and I think that probably was a big reason why I decided to go to college at UC Santa Barbara.
So a famous surfing school, and you played volleyball, but also were a smart guy and graduated cum laude. How'd you wander your way up into the Northern California coast?
Yeah, so after I stopped having a great time playing volleyball and went to law school in Boston College, where I was able to work on some ocean issues involving right whale protection during law school. I took a job with a firm in San Francisco pretty quickly, found myself spending my time across the bridge in Marin, and I have been a North Coaster ever since, over 30 years ago.
So, and you really in your career made the connection between all waters. You worked on river issues, on water distribution in California. You were working with the NRDC, and then what decided you to get into electoral politics?
So my work as an attorney at NRDC involving some big water and salmon issues in the Central Valley really took me pretty deep into the public policy realm. Found myself working with folks in Sacramento and in Congress on some of the policies we thought we needed. And there happened to open up an assembly seat in Marin and Sonoma County. So I ran very much in the lane of the environmental candidate. All of my materials talked about trying to be the first professional environmentalist elected to the legislature. And that was a year, you may remember, when Al Gore came out with his Inconvenient Truth film. It was a moment where I think the public, really locked in on the climate issue. Now we call it a crisis, rightly so, but it was a call to action, that film, and some of the other advocacy that was going on in that moment. And my candidacy sort of happened onto that moment in a very fortuitous way. I was an underdog, wasn't supposed to win, and here I am.
And you've done a lot of amazing work around ocean climate, as well as support for rural economies in your district. Before we get into policy, though, it's just a question of stamina I want to ask. People don't quite get what a congressperson like you does, which is you spend 4 or 5 days a week in Washington, D.C. You then fly cross country, across the whole continent, and then you have to get around your district that stretches from the Golden Gate for 350 miles north and out to the Trinity Alps. How do you just do it from a logistical and family point of view?
Well, you're catching me at a great time to answer that question, David, because I arrived late last night on that long 6-hour flight back from Washington, D.C. I'm coming to you from my home office at 8 a.m. the day after. And as soon as we are done, it's wheels up to the Sonoma coast, where I have a meeting that I'm very excited about to discuss the opportunity to reintroduce sea otters to the North Coast. So a subject that may be of some interest to you and your listeners. It just goes and goes. There's never a slow moment. And while I'm doing all of this, of course, I'm trying to track fast moving, high stakes developments back in Washington about whether our Republican colleagues will crash the global economy and cause us to default on our debt. So there's a lot going on. I like to say that I juggle chainsaws and kittens pretty much all the time.
But you're in a crisis, literally. Since 2014, 95% of the kelp forest north of the Golden Gate has gone away because of impacts from climate change. And for communities like Fort Bragg, California, that means the urchin fishery, the tourism related to abalone diving. There's a crisis. So you've passed legislation. What are you doing to address this and other coastal climate crisis your district faces?
Yeah, well, thanks for your piece. Of course, we need to raise awareness on just how important these kelp forests are and just how central they are to the entire coastal ecosystem up here. For my part, I have been trying to push as much funding as I can into the efforts of the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary and its support group that are doing some work to try to restore kelp forests. And there actually are some interventions that we've found that can work to bring kelp back. Also, though, to get ahead of the science, because, this whole kelp die-off came to us because of changing ocean conditions that caught us off guard. And climate change is going to throw curveballs like that at us all the time. So it's super important that we have the scientific capacity to identify these threats and develop the interventions that are going to be necessary to keep our coastal ecosystems healthy and resilient in the face of these changing ocean conditions. And I've been able to do that through appropriations and the directing of funding to agencies and friend groups like the Greater Farallones group. But also I've got a piece of legislation, actually several pieces of legislation that would be helpful in that regard too.
So we're really happy that you are such a climate activist. You really understand the complexities of ocean protection, restoration of kelp, etc. How do you navigate this in such a polarized environment back in DC, really focusing in on the environment, the ocean, the climate? What are some of your tactics, your skills to actually move your legislation forward?
Yeah, so this area of coastal resiliency, it's not easy because this is a super divided Congress and people mainly want to fight about things. But you can find colleagues across the aisle who understand the importance of habitat to fisheries, who understand the importance of sustainability so that people can catch fish for future generations. And you try to build some common cause with them around that. And sometimes it includes trying to understand the coastal issues that they're dealing with in their district. So, I can't pretend that I've, reached a perfect kumbaya with my Republican coastal colleagues, but we have found issues here and there that we can work on together. And that's about as good as you can do in this Congress.
And one of the big events that's happening in your district, I'll be reporting on this summer, is the largest dam removal in U.S. history, with the tribes on the Klamath River and the commercial fishermen and the upstream farmers having come together. And what's been the role of the federal government and your work on that?
Yeah, so thank you. This is the largest dam removal and river restoration in American history for significant but obsolete hydropower dams on the Klamath River. And for over a decade, we've been talking about them coming out as some aspiration, some ideal out there in the future. It's happening as we speak. They are moving dirt. They are taking the first of these dams out, the Iron Gate Dam, and the rest are going to come out over the course of the next year or so. So the federal government has basically, it has not played a lead role. The impetus for this project came because of a very contentious FERC proceeding where the owner of these dams, Pacific Core, which is Warren Buffett's group, Berkshire Hathaway, and they faced a regulatory gauntlet to get a new 40-year hydropower license from FERC because they were going to have to put in fish passage and all kinds of improvements. These dams have just wreaked havoc on water quality, in addition to blocking fish passage, and they have been terrible for salmon and other fish downstream. Looking at the prohibitive cost that they were going to have to navigate to keep operating these dams for the next 40 years, they made a business decision. They decided it was better to go get the pretty modest amount of power that these dams generate from cheaper and more feasible sources and take these dams out in partnership with the states of California, the state of Oregon, and the folks that I represent downstream, the commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, and a couple of Native American tribes, the Yurok and the Karuk, that have been pushing this for decades. So that's really how it came about. The federal government has largely stayed out of the way, which is, what I've been working hard to try to achieve, to keep them from messing it up. So Klamath was the second biggest salmon producing engine in California, next to the Sacramento-San Joaquin River system historically. And it has just been dying on the vine because of the parasites and terrible water quality created by these dams. So dam removal will be part of our challenge, but it's not the only thing we're going to have to do. We've got a river that has been reshaped behind these dams, and so it's a lot more complicated than just taking out concrete. You're going to have to flush massive amounts and remove massive amounts of sediment. You're going to have to redevelop riparian ecosystems in the footprint of these lakes, and then the habitat upstream is going to have to be ready for salmon to arrive. And so there's a lot of work going into all of those areas as well. But there is no doubt that in the years ahead, and it will take a few years to see, the incredible transformative improvements from this project, but in the years ahead, this is going to be a big shot in the arm for bringing back huge salmon runs on the Klamath.
You're talking about bringing back sea otters, which is interesting. You've got the whales, the seals, the sea lions that are common up there. They haven't been around for a long time. Kind of recreating a natural world and also adapting to a increasingly unnatural one. I spoke with Kim Brugel, who's the mayor of Eureka. Caltrans is talking about moving 101 inland as sea level rise threatens the coastal highways. And what do you see in terms of infrastructure changes and what the role of the federal government in helping adapt to a sea level rise and coastal issues and other climate issues like wildfire?
Yeah, so I think you just tagged a couple of the important challenges we've got to face, and not like someday, like right now, because the impacts of sea level rise and these curveballs that changing ocean conditions are throwing are here and now. So on the infrastructure side, absolutely, Caltrans is going to have to tackle the fact that as you take Highway 101 into Eureka, you are at maybe even in some places below sea level. And that's completely unsustainable in that area. So the easy part is recognizing the problem. The hard part is figuring out what do you do with something like Highway 101. And I don't know what the new alignment would be, or whether they have to put in a causeway of some kind to simply lift it up out of this area that wants to be a wetland and an estuary, and should be a wetland and an estuary. But they're going to have to do either of those two things, or maybe some combination. It's going to be costly. That's why it's really important that they start planning for it, and probably doing it in phases as soon as possible. But that's by no means the only place where that's going to have to happen. I mean, I've got Highway 37 in my district, the exact same issue. You've got other parts of Highway 101 up and down the North Coast where you face the exact same challenge. So we'll be dealing with that for a long time to come. But the other maybe more exciting intervention for your listeners is the opportunity to restore a keystone species to the ecosystem in a way that helps heal it and make it more resilient. And this is where we're going to be challenged to educate people. So you mentioned that you got some blowback from fishermen in the Fort Bragg area, perhaps, about the idea of restoring sea otters. Well, those same fishermen are not catching many rockfish when the kelp forests are gone, because purple urchins have taken over everything, because our starfish all died because of a disease that was brought by changing ocean conditions. And so that's a lot of factors to understand. But that is our challenge, to help explain that, this initial impulse that they might have to say sea otters like to eat fish, that's a threat to me, to help them understand that the sea otter could very well be the salvation for their ability to keep catching fish in the years ahead, if we can repair and rebuild a healthy ecosystem.
So how do you stay informed? We're talking sea level rise, we're talking climate, we're talking transportation infrastructure, ecology. How do you stay informed about all of these emerging issues and developments? And then how do you go about your own process of making the right decisions, because you are representing so many different constituents?
Yeah. Well, it's a constant challenge, Vicki, and I appreciate having uh, folks that I can turn to as resources, like you folks that know your stuff and are in touch regularly with ideas and concerns. I have a great staff, including, I've been fortunate enough to have a Sea Grant fellow that has brought a lot of science capacity on ocean and marine ecosystem issues. Every year I get a Sea Grant fellow, which is kind of cool. It's very competitive, for members of the Natural Resources Committee and other members of Congress, because there's only a handful of these fellows every year. But our office has sort of become one of the go-to places for these smart young people that want to spend a year working in Congress, and they help my other policy staff, which is just constantly working to help me know as much as I can and make good decisions.
So, and you're forward looking too. You're looking at new potential industries. You've introduced a bill to look at seaweed farming off the coast. And of course, Humboldt will be one of the areas they're looking for floating offshore wind. What do you see as future economic opportunities linked to this?
Those are two pretty good ones. One of them might be more of a niche economic opportunity. I don't think seaweed farming is going to be like a Fortune 500 enterprise anytime soon. But it's a pretty cool thing. The more I learn about it, it's something that can happen very sustainably. It's something that a lot of indigenous communities really want to embrace. And so we've got a piece of legislation to try to explore, how we can try to stand up a sustainable coastal seaweed farming industry all up and down the West Coast. This is something that they want to do from Juneau, Alaska, down to my district and even further south. And, the benefits of that go beyond just something that can be a sustainable part of the blue economy. This is something that can be a nutritious part of our food system. This is something that we can mix into cattle feed to help reduce methane emissions from agriculture. So there's just a whole bunch of co-benefits to doing this, even though, it'll never be the next Fortune 500 company. Now, offshore wind is a different story. That is huge economically. That is a game changer. It is the biggest thing to come along economically for the North Coast, since the heyday of something that was very unsustainable, which is the massive clear cutting of our forests that got us into all kinds of trouble with our environmental laws. But this is something that can continue sustainably. The number of jobs is just incredibly exciting. The way we are approaching it off the Humboldt Coast, I don't want to suggest that it's easy, because we've got to iron out some friction between these projects and the commercial fishing industry and other parts of our community. But we are approaching it in a very clear-eyed way, in an inclusive way, where everybody's at the table trying to go forward together. Because I think even the fishing industry, which some parts of which are threatened by offshore wind, let's face it, but they understand there may be some opportunity in this for them as well. There are some revenues that could develop facilities in our working waterfronts that could be hugely beneficial to them. And honestly, if we I think look smartly at these areas, even if offshore wind facilities require some limitations on some types of fishing and some types of gear in some of these areas, those can function a little bit like marine protected areas, and they can create a little more abundance that spills over into the areas that our fishermen do continue to work. And so we need to explore that side of it as well. But look, we got to do this to save the planet, right? if we don't start getting our energy from things like this, we're going to continue to pollute by burning fossil fuel and killing the planet, and nobody's going to have fish. Nobody's going to even have a planet they can live on. So we got to find a way forward.
So, in your view, what are the biggest challenges that's really currently facing the entire nation?
I would say the two biggest, and we have a lot of challenges, but the two biggest would be number one, decarbonization, and probably number two, defending our democracy and the various permutations of that, from voting rights to the rule of law, to the anti-democratic just anachronisms that are built into our Constitution that challenge us in those regards. But that's a little off topic for this podcast, but I worry about those things too.
And they're all linked. I'm curious because I think you may be part of the answer, in that your district represents everything from Marin County, including some of the wealthiest zip codes in the United States, to rural parts of Del Norte and Trinity that are very rural and conservative, low income. What is it that gets everybody supporting you across those different ranges?
Well, not everybody does support me, David. I am really incredibly honored and humbled every time I get reelected with big numbers. I think I tend to get a little north of 75% of the vote, which feels great. But you could flip that around and say, gosh, what did I do to make 1 out of every 4 people hate my guts? So I just keep working at it. I try to show up. I try to be all over my district and do a lot of listening. And this political context that we're all working in is awful. It's divisive. It tries to hardwire all of us to fight with each other and hate each other. And I just try to bring a little bit of a calmer tone to political discourse wherever I go. So far it seems to be working.
Again, you're so busy, and you've got so much territory to cover. When and what do you and your family do to actually enjoy the ocean and get some time off?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of time off, but some of the things that we do, I am fortunate to live about 25 minutes away from the Point Reyes National Seashore and all sorts of other amazing spots on the coast, and we go there all the time. I mean, it is like a go-to getaway. If we find an opening on a weekend, we will go for a hike, or just go to the beach, or do whatever we want to do, picnic or something else on the coast. It's one of my favorite things to do.
I wanted to ask you just a question about kind of balancing your interests. You mentioned some people love you, some people hate you. You really have the big picture. Let's save the planet. Can you describe a time where you had to really make a difficult decision that had to balance the competing interests, and how did you approach the situation?
Yeah, it's a good question for anybody in this position, because you're presented with those difficult considerations all the time. I had to do it in the last Congress when we had very difficult negotiations over a bill we called the Build Back Better Act, which was a big climate bill, but also more than that, it included all kinds of things on the economic fairness and social services, and everything from housing to childcare. We were trying to do really big things in the Build Back Better Act, and I was a huge supporter of it. I had contributed to a lot of the environmental and climate provisions in it. And, we had a difficult decision to make as we thought about advancing that bill, because we had tried to pair it with an infrastructure bill that included other things that I really cared about and worked on, but some bad stuff that Senator Manchin had put in there for the fossil fuel industry. Things like something that actually became law, this absurd and ignorant requirement that in order to develop offshore wind or solar on our public lands, you have to pair an almost equal amount of acreage with fossil fuel development, and open up vast new tracts of the outer continental shelf for our public lands to fossil fuel development in order to have more renewables. That's an insane parity doctrine, if you will. And I accepted it simply because I needed to take that big step forward on wind and solar and climate. And I understood that I was going to have to circle back and try to kill those bad provisions in other ways. So you're just constantly presented with Hobson's choices, if that's the word, and you try to make sure that what you ultimately accept is something you can live with. But we live to fight another day on the parts that we don't like, and I'm not yet old enough that I can contemplate being around maybe longer than Joe Manchin, and I hopefully will have the last say on some of these things.
How much influence do you feel from citizen movements, from sort of bottom-up efforts to get change, and how does that impact legislation or your ability to legislate?
Yeah, it's huge. It's super important. Abraham Lincoln said public opinion is everything. With it, you can do anything. Without it, it's hard to do anything. And we see these movements of young people on issues like gun violence reform and climate action, and just being done with these stupid culture wars. Young people are organizing and finding their voice in ways that are absolutely critical to moving the needle in politics, and it's starting to really be a force. So that to me is exciting. And in the climate space, I think it comes just in time. These are folks who approach these issues with such a personal stake. And it's always amazing to me when you've got a group full of young climate activists who are genuinely worried about whether they should even think about bringing kids into the world, whether they're going to have a planet they can live on. And you have crusty old politicians that think they're too edgy and they won't let them into their office. I approach it just the opposite. My door is wide open for them. I regard them as the best allies I've got on these issues that I've been in the trenches fighting on. I think they're like the cavalry coming to save the day. So I'm a big fan of getting this younger generation plugged in as quickly as we can, because they're gonna help us save it all.
Absolutely. And I've got two kids in their early 20s, and they definitely are very opinionated and want to see a change in our world.
Yeah.
With that, I just want to thank you so much. It's been a delight hearing your insight and your ability to really cover so many issues. And we love that you're keeping the environment, the climate, the ocean forefront in your efforts. So thank you so much for being part of the Rising Tide Ocean podcast.
Thank you both. Good to be with you.
Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by David Helvarg and myself, Vicki Nichols-Goldstein, with support from Natasha Benjamin and Ellie Kurla. Rising Tide's editing services and technical support is provided by Studio Cape May. The theme song is written and performed by Ethan Kenbard. You can find Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast, at bluefront.org or download it from Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free, the sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the Blue Frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the Blue Frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky! There you are. Good boy, Sparky.